Those of you old enough may remember this book. This was my very first serious dinosaur book as a kid, and one of its selling points were the double spreads by John Sibbick. And when it came to ankylosaurs, Euoplocephalus was front and center, and forever the first genus I think of when someone mentions ankylosaur. This is an image in mind whenever I think of it. Striding, head turned towards us, mouth open. And when Carnegie offered its Euoplocephalus in a very similar pose, it consolidated this image for me. Since then, I've gotten plenty of other ankylosaurs, but not Euoplocephalus. It seemed to have fallen off the radar of many companies, but occasionally I wondered if an updated one would show up. Well, now it has, and again, it's Haolonggood who delivers my favorite ankylosaur. The name Euoplocephalus means well-armed head, and comes from the Greek eo, meaning well, oplo, meaning weapon, and kephali, meaning head. I'm sorry my pronunciation is rubbish and probably mixing Greek and ancient Greek. Well-armed head is right, and indeed, you learn even in children's books that even its eyelids were armored. Euoplocephalus was estimated to be about 5.3 meters or 17.3 feet long. This model measures 16 centimeters or 8.7 inches, which is about 1 to 33 scale. For 1 to 35, you're looking at 5.6 meters or 18.3 feet. So I think it's possible at a small stretch. Now here's the Wonder Artistic Models 1 to 35 humanoid. And here's the 1 to 30, and you can decide which scale looks closer to you. There are two color variants. There's a very dark grey, almost in some lighting black one, and the other more of an orange yellow. And I like that the color schemes seem almost like negatives of each other, which makes for a visually contrasting image. But even more interestingly, you'll notice there's a very familiar vibe to this, and that's because, yup, our PNSO Zool. Now, quite unlike ceratopsians, where we now know there could be plenty of variation, in ankylosaurs, the capitulari arrangement do seem to be quite unique to each genus. Arbor in 2013 acknowledged that while some variation exists, there are some capitulari that are distinct enough to be diagnostic. Now, these include the supranarial capitulari, the median nasal, the loreal, the prefrontal, supraorbital, both the anterior and the posterior, the nuchal capitulari, and the squamosal horns. As you can see, there are differences in our Euoplocephalus. They're in general not very distinct, but boundaries aren't really distinct in adults. I think I can make out the median nasal, the postnarial, and a few others. But some more distinct ones, like the supraorbital and the supranasal, cannot be distinctly seen. But Penkalski and others have suggested that squamosal horn height decreases with age, similar to Stygimoloch and Pachycephalosaurus. So we could assume ontogenetic variation, but in general, this looks to be very, very heavily drawn from Scolosaurus. Just based on the sculpt, the detail is very nice. There's a cute look in the eyes, giving it a look of clueless innocence. And as we go along, one thing you'll notice is that being very dark doesn't actually obscure as much detail as you'd imagine. The color fade on the beak is just wonderfully pleasing. And in fact, as you go down the animal, this is something you'll see in the other keratinous bits of the animal. As we move around, we'll see that just in any respectable ankylosaur model, it at least has plenty of detail, nodding to the idea of armor and capitulari. Euoplocephalus is interesting because, as it turns out, we don't have as much of it as many people might think. Very often, it's filled in with Scolosaurus cutleri, starting I believe way back in 1981, when Carpenter reconstructed the armor with Scolosaurus indult. Incidentally, this is where I think that iconic pose of Euoplocephalus originated. On the other hand, Penkalski and Blows argued they were distinct based on armor. For example, in Scolosaurus, the first cervical half-ring is narrow and the two osteoderms completely enclosed within the boundaries of the half-ring. In Euoplocephalus, the lateralmost osteoderms overhang the edges. The paper mentions other differences, such as the osteoderm texture, and I'll link to that below. And speaking of cervical rings, there are also quite distinct elements between ankylosaurs. And here, you can see that in the anterior cervical ring, there are really 3 pairs of osteoderms. This isn't seen in our model today. In fact, there are just 2 pairs of osteoderms, and may be based on Paul's skeletal, as you can see here. They are, however, keeled, which should be the case for Euoplocephalus. With that background in context, let's go ahead and have a look. The most obvious, of course, is the armor and all these osteoderms, and I really have to commend the appearance of these spiky scutes. Now, in some light, there may be a bit of an artificial, plasticky feel to it, kinda like the original PNSO Borealopelta. I really like the way the colors fade here, especially in the bases and some of the edges, fading very nicely into the orange. I think it's an interesting choice to have these scutes here with colored keratin, while these ones here are left dark. This gives it a very forbidding look, and the kind of non-uniformity I like in animal models. There's plenty of sculpted detail, as you'd expect, painted rather simply by Haolonggood's standards, but with enough fades and dry brushing to make the detail pop. Now just look at these various osteoderms. The skin between them, you can see all manner of smaller scutes and ossicles, as again it should be. Overall, it looks very good. For example, just look at how smooth the color transitions are going down into the sides here. And look at the color in the thighs, the legs, and the feet. Not to mention, of course, that detail. And down here in the forelimb, just really nice color and detail. Haolonggood really hasn't slacked off. Now look at the underside. You'll notice that the cloaca does seem very posterior in this model, which you might or might not like. And finally, that tail with a slight curve in the base. but appropriately stiffen the handle, going into that massive tail club. Look at the beautiful texturing and color in the club, looking really grainy and bony. And the form of the club deserves mention, and again seems to be based on this rather well-known Paul reconstruction, who seems to have used Scolosaurus material as suggested by Carpenter, but with the badass tail club of Anodontosaurus. Alright, the other variant. Now, first of all, a bit of a caution. I believe that I may have received a bit of a dud. The colours in the keratinous bits here are fine, but in the skin is where I think that my copy seems to have a shortfall compared to some of my other friends. Now, mainly, it's in the dark mottles and markings, which in mine either seem to be more crudely or sparsely applied, especially in the dry brushing. So whatever you see here, you might actually enjoy a bit more complexity in your own copy. Now, as much as the dark markings on mine have a poverty of complexity, I think you can see that in the osteoderms, they're really nicely painted. The color is of course more vibrant than the dark one. But even in the other collectors with slightly better painted ones than mine, there is still one area that's, I think, definitely inferior, and that's in the tail. Now, you can see here that there's a decidedly less organic look than in the grey. And on the ventral surface, there are hardly any added detail. Again, hopefully yours will look better. We've seen the tail, but we can move up from there. And they just look good together to my eyes. Then we have the other Haolonggood and Ankylosaurid, the Tianzhensaurus. I think you can see how in terms of detail and paint application, the elements of greatness have been there for a very long time. we have, of course, the ankylosaurus. A little bigger than 1/35, but even imagining it a little smaller, you get the idea of different sizes between the members of the same clade. And expanding out of the tribe, we can look at the Pinacosaurus. I almost forgot. The Zoo. And what about a couple of nodosaurids now? We have one of my favorites, the Haolonggood Edmontonia. The Euoplocephalus. And finally, the Sauropelta. Not forgetting our usual size comparators, the T-Rexes. So that's the Haolonggood Euoplocephalus. Once again, they've continued to give us genera that have been neglected, overdue for update, or inexplicable omissions. I'd love to see where they get their ideas for offerings, but whatever they're doing, I'm happy. This is a nice model, and even though there might be a lot of borrowing from Scolosaurus, and if you're really into the anatomy, perhaps the Caputaguli could be more obvious. In general, I think you can be very satisfied with this. Haolonggood is really an exciting company. I'm sure upcoming offerings will have something to delight everybody. I'll see you in the next video.